A secluded house in Minnesota, 3 people dead, a family tragically lost. Behind these doors lies more than just a family tragedy, a controversial film project, lingering questions, and a case that drew attention in certain online communities. Who was David Crowley and what happened? Let's take a closer look. January 2015. In an unremarkable house on the Randall Drive in the quiet town of Apple Valley, Minnesota, police make a shocking discovery. 3 bodies. They are David Crowley, his wife Comel, and their 4-year-old daughter Rania. All 3 show gunshot wounds. Investigators quickly assume a murder-suicide. A tragic family drama as sadly happens again and again. And perhaps the case would have been filed away just like that if it weren't for the story of the family, and especially of David Crowley himself. David Crowley was born on July 7, 1985, the middle of 3 children to Dan and Kate Crowley. He had a brother 3 years older, Dan Jr., who later worked as a personal trainer, and a sister 2 years younger, Allison, who studied architecture. The two grew up together in Owatonna, Minnesota. Their father Dan was an engineer and ran his own company which produced equipment for coating solar panels. When David was 20 years old, his parents divorced. Already in ninth grade, he met a boy in computer class who would play an important role in his life, Mitchell. The two began playing paintball together, a hobby they shared with many other teenagers. Uniforms, helmets, camouflage paint, and at some point David brought his father's video camera. From the game, a shared interest in filmmaking developed. The friends spent weekends watching their self-made short films. Towards at the end of 11th grade, David finally told his parents that he and Mitchell did not plan to attend college after graduation, but wanted to join the army instead. Although his parents would have preferred to see him at a university, their son's well-being was the highest priority, and so they supported his decision. In June 2004, David and Mitch completed basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. Afterward, Mitchell was assigned to Afghanistan, while David was sent to Germany. While his fellow soldiers went out to party in the evenings, he often stayed in the barracks. He taught himself German and studied calculus and chemistry textbooks. In 2006 he was transferred to Iraq, where he served as a mortar gunner. There he experienced an incident that would deeply shape him, a devastating car bomb attack in which 40 US soldiers were killed and many others severely wounded. David was among the first soldiers on the scene. In his journal he later described what he had witnessed. Dozens of men were lying on the ground, moaning, screaming, and their bodies torn apart. He wrote about picking up severely injured female soldier and placing her into a vehicle. Half her body was a yellow mess. The skin hung in shreds. She whimpered, "Can we please hurry? Please hurry." With that, the shocking accounts of this experience ends. At the end of 2009, David Crowley was once again stationed in Germany. He had previously been at Fort Hood in Texas in 2007, and it was there in 2008 that he met the woman who would later become his wife Comel. She was studying at Baylor University and still lived with her parents Naila and Anjum Alam, and her younger sister Sidra. The family had only fled Pakistan 3 years earlier and had left much behind. In Pakistan they had lived comfortably. The mother and daughters had their own chauffeurs, and the house and household were managed by staff. In the United States, they now had to learn to build a completely new life, without luxury, without support, standing on their own. Just a few weeks after David and Kamal met, David received news that he would be deployed to Afghanistan. His service term was actually nearing its end, and he was far from happy about it. He filed an objection, but it was in vain. Deployment went through regardless. Before he left, however, he and Kamal got married. They shared the decision with Kamal's parents, who later said they were initially completely shocked, but eventually accepted it. "If you love each other, who are we to stand in your way?" they reportedly said. The couple married, and one detail would later play a role in one of the theories surrounding the Crowley case. Kamal had converted from Islam to Christianity in order to marry David. Shortly after the wedding, David was deployed to Afghanistan. He knew he could have refused, but that would likely have resulted in a prison sentence longer than his remaining deployment period. Instead, he pursued another plan. Once there, he informed his superior that, under the circumstances and considering the way the deployment had been enforced, he could not guarantee that he would adequately protect his comrades in the event of combat. As a result, he was reassigned to the post office. For the remainder of his deployment, he faced harassment from his superiors, apparently as a form of punishment for attempting to avoid field duty. What had begun as enthusiasm for the military gradually turned into deep resentment. Some would later describe it as outright hatred. His relationship with the army deteriorated to the point that he forbade his wife Comel from meeting him at the airport upon his return. Normally, soldiers are reunited with their families there. David, however, insisted that Comel wait outside, away from the airport. He did not want the military dictating when he could see his wife. Comel had already become pregnant before his deployment, and in September 2009 their daughter Rania was born. The young family moved to Minnesota. Comel knew no one there, and she was unhappy. On the phone she complained to her sister about how depressing and cold it was. David, together with friend Mitchell, attended a film school program called Digital Video and Media at the Minnesota School of Business. Comel, on the other hand, took a position as a research assistant at the University of Minnesota. By this point, David had already changed. He did not want Comel to invite colleagues to their home. David also didn't want Comel to maintain private contact with co-workers. He wanted to keep every aspect of their life private. He had become distrustful of nearly everyone. Many people today believe that the death of David Crowley and his family may be connected to his film project called Grey State. In 2010, David attended film school, and through his professor he met a man named Danny Mason. The two discussed a wide range of topics. One day, Mason sent him an email with links to various websites. These sites were about conspiracy theories, allegedly suppressed information, secret plans against the population, and government control mechanisms. Mason later explained that David told him he had stayed awake for 24 hours reading through all these websites. Afterward, he decided to make a film about the subject. He began researching and simultaneously wrote his screenplay. In total, 6 versions were created, and he eventually settled on the one that would later carry the final title Grey State. In this version, a foreign power attacks the United States and begins taking over the country piece by piece. This foreign power infiltrates the US government, and as a result, massive uprising occur among the population. The government's response, it deploys its own security forces, the military, and especially FEMA against the citizens. What sounds like science fiction in David's eye had a real basis. In fact, even political circles in the US were concerned with some of the topics he wanted to address in the film. Much of what David had researched was initially dismissed publicly as a mere conspiracy theory, but in the meantime, certain developments have occurred and documents have been released that show that some of his concerns were at least conceivable. But David himself was no longer able to complete his film. FEMA in particular played a central and in his view a very problematic role in his considerations. Yet in fact, there are a number of strange aspects surrounding this organization that continues to spark discussions to this day. The United States has many authorities and institutions responsible for internal security, and of course, disaster control is also part of this internal security. In the US, the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was originally primarily responsible for disaster relief. It gained greater public recognition, even a positive reputation, through its work after Hurricane Katrina or during the events of 9/11. Its tasks included helping rebuild destroyed houses, providing financial support, and supplying the population during emergencies. After the attacks of September 11, however, a new authority was created in the United States, the US Department of Homeland Security. Under this new department, numerous organizations that had previously been independent were consolidated, including FEMA. Practically everything that had anything to do with the internal security was placed under Homeland Security Department. Originally, there were even plans to integrate the FBI and CIA, but those plans were later abandoned. For FEMA, this step meant a fundamental change in its responsibilities. From then on, it was not only supposed to help during natural disasters, but also protect the American population from terrorists and other threats. In emergency, FEMA was granted far-reaching powers. If there was a national threat, the government could transfer certain authorities to FEMA, and the agency would then have the right to remove people from their homes if necessary, in order to use the buildings. It could confiscate food supplies if needed to support its personnel, and it could suppress uprising if necessary, even with the use of weapons. If one of the situations for which FEMA is responsible were to occur, the agency would in principle have control over the country with extensive decision-making power over nearly every area of public life. One of these situations would also be a large-scale uprising of the population. After the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, a rumor eventually emerged. The agency was said to have begun building special camps, so-called FEMA camps. And accordingly to those who claim to have seen these camps, their security features are striking. They are oriented inward, not so that no one can get in from the outside, but so that no one can get out from the inside. At their core, such facilities would resemble prisons. FEMA itself denies ever having built such camps. They admit to constructing shelters, but only for people who have lost their homes due to disasters or other events. Still, photos keep appearing that supposedly show these camps. The official FEMA facilities the agency emphasizes are by no means fenced or guarded complexes. One can enter and leave them as one wishes, but otherwise claim the opposite, that camps were being built in the United States and that there were even photos of them. Some of these voices went so far as to say that there were now around 800 of these alleged camps, fenced, monitored by cameras, equipped with guard towers, multiple barracks, and large gathering areas, each one supposedly capable of holding thousands of people. Whether one believes these claims or not, they initially caused little more than a shrug among the general public. FEMA continued to be regarded as a protective organization. Many of the reports about the inward-facing security features were dismissed at the time as pure conspiracy theories. But then another claim surfaced, that Homeland Security had ordered 1.6 billion rounds of hollow point ammunition for FEMA from the company ATK. For comparison, during the Iraq War, a total of around 6 billion rounds were used. Here, however, the claim was about more than a billion hollow point bullets, ammunition that is considered controversial and, in some conflicts, partially banned. This claim too was initially dismissed as speculation, but later press reports document appeared that at least partially confirmed the matter. Remarkably, parts of the US Congress apparently had not been informed about it. Politicians asked the obvious questions. Why does an agency that officially serves to protect the population need 1.6 billion rounds of such ammunition? Homeland Security answer was that a large portion of it was needed for FEMA training and construction purpose. They had never intended and would never intend to use this ammunition against the American population. They simply had to be prepared for any contingency. But the discussions hardly subsided because soon another accusation emerged. FEMA was said to have ordered 3.5 million plastic coffins, each one large enough to hold 3 to 5 people. This too was initially denied and dismissed as a wild theory, but over time it became clear that such order did in fact exist. FEMA official explanation was that they needed to be prepared for very large-scale disasters, for attacks with chemical or biological weapons, for nuclear incidents, natural disasters, or epidemics. In an emergency, they would need to be able to bury many victims quickly and hygienically in order to prevent the spread of disease. Of course, the purchase of 3.5 million plastic coffins would not be widely announced publicly. After all, they didn't want unnecessarily alarm the population, but mistrust grew. What did an organization that supposedly existed to protect the population really want with around 800 alleged camps that were said to resemble prison camps? What with 1.6 billion rounds of hollow point ammunition and millions of coffins? What was the agency really preparing for? David Crowley had gathered all of this information at a time when it was barely known to the broader US public, and based on all of it he wrote the script for his film Grey State. The dystopian film showed from Crowley's perspective what it might look like if FEMA were to take control. Oppression, violence against the population, the suppression of uprisings, even executions. In his concept trailers, the film itself was never completed. He depicted these scenarios in strong, intense images. In the movie Grey State, all those things were to be addressed that the public at the time knew little about. The alleged camps, the massive ammunition purchase, the acquisition of millions of plastic coffins. To realize the film, however, Crowley needed fundings. He approached various film studios in the United States, but none were willing to support the project. So he launched a crowdfunding campaign. Within a short time, over 61,000 euros were raised, enough to begin the filming, but it never came to that. Shortly before his death, David Crowley had a conversation with an acquaintance named Mason Hendricks. He told him he had an information that would hit like a bomb. What it was, we'll probably never know, because he never got the chance to explain it. David Crowley's family, his wife Comel's family, and many of his friends and colleagues and numerous people who deal extensively with topics such as government secrecy and abuse of power are convinced to this day that David Crowley was eliminated. According to this theory, someone wanted to prevent him from completing his film and making public certain things that, so they claim, only few people knew about. This is the main assumption of those who believe in conspiracy. The investigative authorities, however, see things very differently. When the bodies of David Crowley, Comel and their daughter Rania were discovered on January 7, 2015, the police immediately assumed a murder-suicide. However, at first hardly any information was released about how the investigators reached this conclusion. It took a long time before any details became public, details about what was actually found inside the Crowley home. It is believed today that the enormous uproar on the internet, triggered by the news of David Crowley's death, is what first made the public realize who Crowley was and what he had been working on. As a result, specialists were brought in again, including an internet crime unit. The Crowley home was thoroughly searched, all computers and laptops were seized, a total of 16 hard drives. After all digital data had been analyzed, the police finally confirmed the original conclusion. The case was a murder-suicide. The base for this assessment, the investigators explained, was primarily David Crowley's journal. But before we get to that, let's look at the situation the officer encountered. When David Crowley's parents contacted the police and explained that their son had been unreachable for an unusually long time, the officers gained access to the house. In the living room, they found Crowley's wife Comel and the 5-year-old daughter Rania, both with gunshot wounds to the head. Nearby lay David Crowley, also with a fatal head wound. A few steps away was a .40 caliber pistol. Later it was determined that this was the weapon from which the shots had been fired. Crowley's fingerprints were on it. On one of the walls, the sentence Allahu Akbar had been written in blood, as investigators determined the blood belonged to Kamal. On the living room table was also a note: "Open the rise, most recent version, submit to Allah now." The first two sentences were later interpreted by investigators as possibly referring to the newest version of Crowley's Grey State concept trailer. However, nothing was found there that pointed to the act or to a motive. Then the investigators came across David Crowley's journal. Several experts examined it and reached a similar conclusion. The entries increasingly showed signs of a developing psychosis. At first, Crowley wrote with affection about his wife and daughter. He described his life as an adventure, filled with love, energy, and ideas. But from the time he began working intensely on Grey State, the tone changed. The entries became darker. He wrote that fate had destined him to fade into obscurity. Over time, the text became stranger and in some parts barely understandable. Many of his later entries were hardly comprehensible. But with the help of the autopsy reports and numerous statements from friends and acquaintances, investigators were able to narrow down the likely time of death with remarkable precision. It was around 3 weeks before the day the family was found. Just 2 days before the estimated date, David Crowley made a particularly disturbing entry in his journal. The psychologists who analyzed the document believed that this entry marks the moment when Crowley finally lost his grip on reality. However, there were other clues that suggested suicide, and possibly one that may not have come as a surprise to his wife. Some experts even considered possible that she agreed to a joint decision to end their lives. It is believed that the act took place shortly before Christmas. During that time, David and Comel began visiting friends. Witnesses later reported that the two had seemed unusually cheerful, almost overly energetic. This is behavior psychologists often observe in people who have already made a drastic final decision. To outsiders, it often appears as if everything is fine, because the decision itself gives these individuals a sense of relief. But that was not all. David and Comel returned borrowed items, books, games, and also gave their friends small gifts. This behavior too fits with people who are consciously organizing and concluding their lives. All these aspects, together with the increasingly gloomy diary entries, led the investigators to conclude that it was almost certainly a joint suicide. And there was another serious finding. Apparently, David Crowley was still alive after his wife and daughter were already dead. His bare footprints were found in the blood of the two, which had pooled across the floor, so he must have walked through the puddle of blood. Whether he himself had written the phrase Allahu Akbar on the wall could no longer be clearly determined later. Too much blood was spread across the entire surface, and Crowley himself was lying on the floor with blood-smeared hands. For the police, however, the case was settled at the latest at that point. From their perspective, it was clearly an extended suicide, and Crowley's diary clearly showed how he increasingly detached from reality and ultimately pulled his wife down into the abyss with him. Comel's family had originally moved from Pakistan to the United States. The reason? A lifestyle could not have reconciled with the strict cultural expectations there. In the United States, they already had relatives over the years made contact with other Pakistani families. Comel herself had converted to Christianity in order to marry David. And then the police found those entries in the house, and the bloody inscription Allahu Akbar on the wall. On a laptop that was in standby mode on the crime scene, the message, "Submit to Allah now," appeared when it was powered on. The exact same sentence that was written on the notepad. At first, this led to the consideration that David might have been forced to write these words. Extremist group view leaving Islam as an act punishable by death, and Comel had taken this step. But the investigators reached a different conclusion. After analyzing the handwriting, they were convinced that the notes had indeed been written by David. Consequently, the police assumed that he himself had written the sentence on the wall. For them, this was further evidence on his psychological decline. Friends and relatives, however, find this explanation illogical. Religion had played no role for either of them. They had never spoken about such topics, so why would David suddenly write Islamic phrases on the wall? For many in their circle, it seemed more like a deliberately planned false trail, a staging by the perpetrators. But the police found no signs of forced entry. One thing was noticeable, though: the back door to the garden. It was open, despite the icy winter. For the relatives, this is another piece of the puzzle. They suspect the murder might be connected to Grey State, the film David had planned to make. The weapon also raises questions. It was a 40 caliber pistol. Multiple shots would have been necessary for multiple victims. Shots that any neighbor should have heard. The family therefore believes that a silencer was used and that the weapon was then placed in David's hands in order to put his fingerprints on it. But when the police arrived at the crime scene, the pistol was not in his hands, but slightly away from his body. The investigators did not consider this suspicious either. In their view, it is common for a weapon to slide or fall a short distance to the side after a shot is fired. So, that was the David Crowley case. What do you guys think? Was it a murder or suicide? And what do you think the secret was that David didn't tell Mason? Yeah, that was my first video. I hope you guys liked it. And in the description you will find the movie trailer for Grey State, the film that David wasn't able to finish. See you next time. Bye bye.